Hey there! Shadow the Hedgehog is one of the most dynamic characters in Sonic's world, and many of the stories connected to him are responsible for some of the most expansive lore building in the series, some of which have yet to be realized. Today, we're going to talk about a small but no less important part of Shadow's character, his shoes. Welcome back to Loops and Lore. My name is Ben, and today we're going to discuss how the technology to make boost boots could exist so far in the past. How do they actually work, and why doesn't everyone have them? You can tell a lot about a person from their footwear, with Sonic and Friends being no exception. In the case of Shadow, he was sealed away in his boostin' booties 50 years before the events of Sonic Adventure 2. Meaning that the technology behind them is, at this point in the game's story, also 50 years old. Oftentimes, a mystery like this would simply be written off as because video game, which would be fine, except that, in this case, even with how much of Shadow's past is still unknown, there is enough there to come up with a better answer. First, let's figure out how the technology timeline in Sonic's world compares to our own so we can build a more definitive theory. The beginning level of Sonic Adventure 2's hero story is City Escape, a level that was heavily inspired by San Francisco. And between the cars, trolley, and buildings, everything here looks the same as our world at the time of the game's release, the year 2001. That is until we see Guns robots show up. Even when they send a whale of a truck to try and chase Sonic down, its exterior design still looks contemporary for its time. But really, looking at all of the games that are part of the current narrative, Sonic's world, at least in the locations that contain humans, appear to exist with present-day technology that is comparable to our own, at least until Gun or Eggman are involved. But if we can assume that Adventure 2 takes place in 2001, well, that would make the events surrounding Shadow's past take place in the early 1950s. This seems a bit difficult to comprehend when you consider all of the advanced technology that is shown or mentioned in any of these flashbacks, as most of it would be impossible in our reality. Space colonies, advanced combat robots, AI programs, none of these would have been possible in our 1950. However, in our world, the space race of the 1950s did have a major influence on design, and roller skating had reached one of its peaks in popularities during this same era. And since many things from our world cross over to Sonic's, it's reasonable to assume that their Earth culture would have been very similar. Gerald's own journal reveals to us that Maria had a hand in helping to design Shadow's accessories, including his air shoes. We know that Maria was deeply in love with the Earth and was probably fascinated by the culture of the day, so her having the idea to combine these two influences together to create rocket-powered roller skates certainly makes sense in concept, but from an engineering perspective, it should have been out of the question. But the same could be said for the low Earth orbit space colony she called home. And yet, in Sonic's 1950, both exist. This is, of course, all thanks to Dr. Gerald Robotnik. Gerald was a genius, though we don't know if his intellect surpassed our own Eggman, but we do know that, unlike Ivo, he didn't do it alone. Gerald's journal informs us that he was not merely a brilliant scientist, but also a lover of archaeology. This gave him insight not just into the world of science and robotics, but also of past civilizations. In the now decanonized Sonic Chronicles, it is revealed that the Nocturnus clan of Echidnas had incredible technology prior to their banishment in the Twilight Cage. Although none of this is part of the current narrative, it follows the same theme we have now, that there were advanced races in the long-forgotten past of Sonic's world. From the ancients to the creators of Emerald, from echidnas to the sun gazers, and even the Babylonians. But beyond technology, Sonic's world is also full of unique power sources that cannot be explained by conventional science alone. The Master Emerald, Dark Onyx, Iblis, or Gaia. All things that Gerald could have had some knowledge on and would have dramatically influenced his work. Though his understanding of the Gizoid was limited, Gerald was able to modify some of its programming, and of course, he was aided by Black Doom in the creation of Shadow, and also had access to a Chaos Emerald while on board the Ark. None of these things detract from Gerald's genius, but rather enabled him to realize his full potential as a scientific mastermind, far exceeding the achievements of other scientists of his day. And this explains why everything he was involved with was able to advance so rapidly while the rest of the world remained the same, and also why such advancements seem to have stalled out in his absence. So okay, now we know how boost boots could exist so far in the past, but how exactly do these things work? We have almost no lore-bound information on air shoes to go off of, at least in terms of their mechanics. So we're really going to need to study the design of the shoes themselves for any clues about how they work. And to start off, packaging is tight. Assuming that Shadow has feet inside those shoes, we don't have much extra room compared to the rest of our anthropomorphic animal friends. So if there are any mechanical parts, they need to be small. Just above the ankle of the shoe is Limiter Ring, a device that Shadow uses both to channel and keep his power under control, and we will come back to them later. The shoes themselves are white and black, having a red frame along the edges that look like a sort of bumper or guard. They run from the toe to the arch of the shoe, and then after the arch to the heel. Underneath, we see that each shoe has 5 exhaust ports, 2 on the back of the shoe and 3 on the front, with the port below the toe angled forward. These ports are what emit an exhaust flame that the shoes generate to build thrust. Shadow uses this force to skate, hover, and boost. The more I studied the design of these boost boots, I couldn't help but be reminded of a revolutionary technology from back in my ancient past, which for me was the 90s. Back then, these adjustable slip-on skates were super popular. You didn't need to lug around an extra pair of shoes, and when you were done skating, you just took them off. Shadow's shoes already have a skate-like appearance, with the forward exhaust port resembling a front stopper, and each shoe having 4 additional ports, like the 4 wheels on a skate. But comparing the design to these kid skates and Shadow's air shoes, they do look shockingly similar. This is a fun reference in itself, but also makes a great deal of sense for Shadow. Remember, the air shoes are meant to be an accessory for the Hedgehog, something that could aid him in his many missions. Unlike the skates of my childhood, Shadow doesn't need to take his off to stop rolling, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't be removed or swapped out for different models if the situation called for it. The air shoes make sense for traversing the inside of the Ark or the space around it, but these could be traded out for an alternative attachment if the need arose. There are, after all, many different types of shoes that best fit different types of situations. And it's likely Gerald could have built any number of variants if he had gotten the chance. That is, assuming that there are no Dr. Gerald capsules hidden throughout the Ark. I mean, come on. That would be the easiest reference that this series has ever made. But I'm getting off track. We studied the design and have understood the limitations, but we still haven't figured out what makes these shoes tick. Like we said before, Gerald was an incredible genius with access to resources far beyond his contemporaries. Did he find a way of stuffing a highly powerful miniature engine into those shoes? Not likely. At least, not if we are thinking of the internal combustion engines we see in cars, motorcycles, or even gas-powered models. Those engines need air, compression, spark, and fuel. Trying to draw air into the same ports used for the exhaust and compress it into a usable charge before releasing it as the guards scrape the ground to create a spark sounds plausible in a world like this, if we had the room for all the complexity that we would have to pack into such a small space. Plus, the shoes would need electronics inside that could meter the amount of fuel needed for the volume of air, regardless of whether or not Shadow is skating through the artificial climate of the Ark, the space around it, or on Earth. And this makes even less sense when you factor hovering and boosting, where there is no intake stroke of Shadow kicking the shoe forward to scoop up fresh air, nor is there a spark created if Shadow jumps and starts to hover. But we do have a flame regardless. So the shoes can't be powered by magnets, electricity, or a simple fan rotor, as none of these would create thrust via combustion. And speaking of combustion, where is the fuel coming from? Maybe we need to look at some other transportation in Sonic's world in order to really figure this out. Transportation like hover skates. In Sonic Riders, the extreme gear run off a supply of highly dense or pressurized air, and the bikes, boards, and skates utilize the release of that pressure in order to generate thrust. Sort of like what happens when you release a balloon full of air. Somehow, the extreme gear do so in an incredibly clean way that emits a small amount of light, but doesn't actually give off a flame. So, regardless of whether or not Gerald was borrowing from any research he may have done on the ancient Babylonians, it's definitely a different form of propulsion than the one used in extreme gear. And that only leaves us with one remaining possibility: a rocket engine. And yes, I know this should have been the most obvious choice, but I want you to understand why I came to this conclusion by first debunking any other possible methods of propulsion before going further. In Sonic Adventure 2, Team Sonic uses a space shuttle just like the NASA orbital vehicle of our world to reach the Ark. The shuttle uses a massive fuel tank and twin booster rockets for takeoff, just like the real-world equivalent. And we see Shadow use another shuttle in Dark Beginnings, once again in order to get to the Ark, and once again strapped to a massive fuel tank and set of boosters. These shuttles appear to function identically to the orbital vehicles of our own world, and in our world, liquid fuel rockets became a reality in the 1920s. Sure, they weren't anything compared to the ones used in a NASA space shuttle, but that technology would have had plenty of time to be developed and used by Gerald in order to make boost boots. Okay, so now the timing is believable, but what about the packaging? Going back to the OV series of space shuttles, they utilize a cryogenic liquid fuel rocket engine called the SSME, or Space Shuttle Main Engine, also known as the RS-25. As complex as they are, the engine itself is not much larger than the nozzle used to focus the thrust in order to create enough pressure to move whatever it's mounted to. Keeping that in mind, let's look back at the bottom of Shadow's air shoes. The nozzle is not very large, meaning that the engine attached to it would not have to be very large either. And that is where we get to the best part. Shadow's shoes are, at least in concept, technically the very first Badnik. Going back to Gerald's journal, it mentions that both the air shoes and limiter rings were created as accessories for Shadow. The limiter rings serve the purpose not just of keeping his power in check, but also as a way of focusing them to key areas where he can unleash that power. Chaos Spear from his hands, and the air shoes on his feet. Going back to the RS-25, all of the mechanics and plumbing needed to fuel and run the engine disappear if that engine is Shadow himself. So instead of all those mechanical parts of the rocket engine, Gerald would only need to design a contact, a way of transferring Shadow's power like an electrical connection. And as complex as that might sound, in principle, it's actually pretty simple. The human brain, as an example, works by creating pulses of electricity that move through your nervous system. That's how your brain tells your hand to hit the button on a controller in order to send a spinning hedgehog through the mad machines of a rogue scientist. It's also how your brain recognizes that your foot is touching the ground and tells all of the muscles connected to it to extend in order to push off of that ground and allow you to propel yourself forward as you run. The same principles work with an electronic brain that uses a system of circuits, switches, and resistors to control the flow of electricity in order to operate a machine. You, pushing the button on a controller, sent a similar signal through it to what your brain sent to your leg. So how does this relate to boosted booties? Imagine the limiter ring as a sort of resistor that slows down the flow of energy through a particular part of Shadow's body. This would create a safe range of energy that the shoe could use, allowing it to not just be an on-off switch where the shoe is either doing absolutely nothing or operating at full tilt until it causes Shadow to collapse or the shoe explodes. That energy could then be sent into a special sole that doubles as a conductive pad. This would make it easier for Shadow to control the amount of energy expelled from the shoe by sheer will. But also, since the energy required is being produced by Shadow, he is the engine powering the device. The shoe is merely part of the nozzle by which the energy is being expelled. This explains why the shoes are unique to Shadow, and ironically, this also explains how Shadow creates and shoots Chaos Spears without disintegrating his own hand. It's something we see for mere seconds, but in the end of Shadow's story in Sonic 06, when Mephiles the Dark creates an army of Mephilice, he tells Shadow that his limited power won't be enough to defeat him. Shadow responds by removing the limiter rings from his wrists and showing his loathsome copy who the real ultimate life form is. But in that moment, as the rings drop from his arms, we see a gray band around Shadow's wrists that the limiter rings would have wrapped around. The bands appear to be ventilated in the center and have a red alignment mark at the top. This is the only time we ever see Shadow remove the rings in-game, although the ending of Sonic Adventure 2, where Sonic hands one of the limiter rings to Rouge, suggests that he must have taken them off near the end of the fight with the Bio-Lizard. But there are other moments outside the games where the limiters are removed. In Sonic X, while teaming up with Sonic to stop the Ark, Shadow removes the limiter rings from his wrists, but eagle-eyed watchers would notice that in the next cut, they're missing from his ankles as well, exposing black fabric underneath. Although it's important to note that this episode aired not long after 06 had just begun production, so it's possible that the show inspired the game, and the game in turn inspired the movie. Because in Sonic Movie 3, Shadow would also remove the limiter rings in order to push the Eclipse cannon away from the Earth. A detail you might have missed in this movie is that there's a recess in Shadow's limiter rings that glows while he's in his super form. If you slow the movie down to about a quarter speed, you can see that when Shadow removes the limiter rings, there's a pair of electrical connectors where the rings join, and there's a spark of electricity as he takes them off. And at that same moment, the rings also stop glowing. But beneath where those rings would have been on Shadow's wrists is a gray band that, again, has a recess in the middle, hinting that, once again, this is how Shadow's chaos energy is vented out of his body and into the limiter rings. And although the limiter rings are still on Shadow's ankles at the end of 06, we can assume that Game Shadow has similar bands underneath those rings as well. This means that in almost every single in-game fight, Shadow is always holding back, which really suits his personality. He simply doesn't see most opponents of being worthy of the full power of the ultimate life form. However, there's more to this than just Shadow not thinking an opponent is worth it. The limiter rings are also a key to Shadow not being able to expend too much of his energy, or in some cases, simply burning up due to his own power. In Cross Shadow Generations, Gerald explains to Shadow that the limiter rings were made to keep Shadow's power in check, but while under the influence of Doom's powers in white space, Shadow's power was so immense that taking them off in that moment could cause him to explode. Combine this with what we see in movie 3 while in super form, and it's obvious that the rings are capable of keeping an incredible amount of energy in suspension. Which makes me wonder if the rings were part of how Gerald was going to cure Maria, and if Shadow's wearables were a way to test how to safely use his energy in controlled amounts as a sort of radiation treatment for Maria. But I guess we will never know. Either way, this makes the relationship between the shoes and Shadow a sort of biomechanical one, as the shoes use the life energy of Shadow to perform an otherwise mechanical function. No different than a pink bird powering a robot, indicating that in terms of design, the egg really doesn't roll far from the nest. And with that, I'm Ben. This has been Loops and Lore. Sayonara, Shadow fans, and thanks for watching.